I'm going to be talking about debt and deficits in an environment with low interest rates, in particular with real rates on government debt below the growth rate of the economy. This has been a hot topic in policy discussions recently, particularly after the paper by Olivier Blanchard in which he argued that debt might, in this context with R less than G, entail what he called zero fiscal costs. So I'm going to talk about it a little bit informally, and then go through a simple but complete and closed dynamic equilibrium model to just make a few points. Zero interest rates on government debt, The Economist magazine characterized them on its cover a few weeks ago as free money, because it seems that when real rates on government debt are very low, essentially zero, debt finance is possible with no requirement for future primary surpluses. In fact, if the interest rate can be positive, and if the economy is growing at a rate that at a positive rate, if the real rate on government debt is below that, then the government debt can be rolled over indefinitely, while the debt to GDP ratio stays constant or declines. So if this is true, and R less than G is a permanent situation, you can ask, why should you ever raise taxes when raising expenditures? Taxes are distorting and have a real cost. And it seems that if government debt as a fraction of GDP stays stable or shrinks, that there's no real cost to maintaining debt. Versions of this idea have been labeled modern monetary theory by people on the political left. And quite a while before that, Reagan's Vice President Cheney was quoted as saying during policy discussions of the Reagan administration, or not of the Bush administration, Reagan taught us that deficits don't matter. There might be some truth to this, but it's important to know how much and under what circumstances. One naive way to look at this is to say, well, the government's budget constraint is B dot equals RB minus tau. Tau is the primary surplus. Primary surplus of X being taxes and G being expenditures. B dot, the rate of growth of debt, is the real rate of interest on debt minus the primary surplus. You solve that unstable differential equation. So long as R is greater than 0, it's unstable. You solve it forward, and you get this expression that debt is the discounted present value of future primary surpluses. Notice that I've said step 1 and step 4 here. There's the general solution to that equation has an extra term, some constant times e to the RT. The way people get rid of that term is to invoke what people will informally call transversality. E to the minus RT BT goes to 0 as T goes to infinity. However, transversality is an optimization. It's a condition of optimization, like an Euler equation. It's something that emerges from some agent's optimization problem. And the question is there an agent for whom this condition is a necessary condition for optimality. The actual private transversality condition in some simple models does turn out to be what I label transversality there. But if R is less than the agent's discount rate beta, it's the private discount rate beta, not R, which appears in the private transversality condition. Of course, in a richer model, there would be a stochastic private discount factor, and the R could be time varying, but so we're going to stick to simpler perfect foresight cases. In a model with real capital whose equilibrium return matches the discount rate beta, which would be the usual result in a model without uncertainty, the transversality condition is going to be e to the minus beta t kt plus bt goes to 0, where k is capital holdings per capita and b is real debt holdings per capita. And this is for an individual. For the economy, you have to start taking account of the growth rate. And this is for an individual in an economy with constant population and without technological progress. If we know K is positive, that both K and B are necessarily positive, in other words, there's a borrowing constraint and real capital can't be negative, then this transversality condition implies e to the minus beta t bt goes to 0. But we're interested in the case where beta exceeds R. And so this condition puts weaker constraints on, stronger constraints on B than the e to the minus RT BT. In order to use that optimality condition to derive something like the what people label the intertemporal budget constraint, you have to adjust terms in the government budget constraint. We've now written it out as we're allowing a nominal government debt, capital B, and a price level. Real debt growth is beta times B. It's actually, of course, R times B, but we're going to put in beta times B here and then subtract beta B out over on the other side again. We're going to call this beta minus R plus pi B term seigniorage and label it sigma. Now this equation we can solve forward if we lump these things together and call them sigma. And that'll give us a quote intertemporal budget constraint. It looks like this. It says that the real debt is the discounted present value, discounting at the private agent's discount rate of the sum of primary surplus and this term I've called seigniorage. You can rearrange it so that it says if we start with debt and a planned sequence of future expenditures, GT plus S, the discounted present value of the future expenditures plus the current debt has to match the discounted present value of future taxes plus the seigniorage. And this should be sigma T plus S, of course. So this exercise is simple calculus and algebra, but it's useful because it brings out the point that in general, even when you can raise finance expenditures without taxing, by increasing sigma T, by changing sigma T and xt plus S are two sources of revenue. And if we take actions that reduce sigma t, we're going to have to increase x and vice versa. And that's not always true. It's an interesting question under what circumstances might it be true that when we increase b, we generate increases in sigma big enough to finance the increase in debt. In other words, can you run a completely self-financed debt expansion? That's a non-trivial question because seigniorage depends on the level of debt. So depending on the nature of this term, it might be possible that increases in debt could in steady state result in a big enough increase in seigniorage so that there would be no need to increase X when you increase B, holding the G fixed. In the model that we're going to look at, it turns out that that happy circumstance doesn't come up. Note in order for it to come up, it has to be that the tax base for seigniorage, which is basically the transactions or liquidity value of government debt, has to be big enough to create that much revenue as you increase B. And also, if X is already very large, then increases in B that come with large increases in X are unlikely to be financeable. Large permanent increases in X are unlikely to be financeable entirely by sigma. So what's the right balance between X and sigma? You can't answer this fully without both detailed analysis of transactions or liquidity services of money and of government debt. Nowadays, people are pursuing the idea that interest-bearing government debt, all maturities, actually provides some kind of services, transactions or liquidity or insurance services. And if that's true, and we simply model that as saying that these services contribute to utility or to output, the Friedman Rule, which was based, when Friedman put it forward, was based on the idea that money provides transaction services. The Friedman Rule is that you should drive sigma t to 0. Since government paper costs almost nothing to produce, yet is providing a service that people value. Chari and Kehoe have a paper that argues that the Friedman Rule is optimal in a very general class of models, even when all available taxes are distortionary. And if you just say, well, if you relabel M in the Chari-Kehoe discussion as B, which makes some sense nowadays because all kinds of debt pay almost no interest. So as a first approximation, it might make sense just to say that there's only one kind of government debt or government liability. Also, what Friedman used to label money had paid 0 interest rate, and yet now reserves pay interest. So the distinction between money and the rest of government debt has become much more fragile. And if you think of all government debt the way Friedman thought about money, you get to a Friedman Rule for total government debt, which says it should be optimal to drive the gap between the return on government paper and the return on other kinds of investments to 0. Some people, like Jeremy Stein, have argued that the balance sheet of the Fed should be expanded until the rate of return on Fed Reserve Federal Reserve deposits matches the long rate, so the yield curve is flat. That's based on a similar argument that short government securities pay so much less than long that they must be providing an important transaction service, and by the same kind of argument that Friedman used, it seems like it should be a good idea to expand them until that differential is gone. But in general, if we take G and the initial debt as given, pursuing the Friedman rule and lowering sigma requires raising X. And if X is made up of distorting taxes, it's not obvious that this is a good idea. So here's a simple model within which we can look at the trade-off. It has characteristics that make it essentially impossible that debt is self-financing, but it's calibrated to be vaguely realistic. So it's a model in which government debt enters the private budget constraint as providing transaction services. So government debt is return dominated. It pays less than the private discount rate. It's a representative agent model. Their only input is labor. Just one kind of government liability that's nominal, duration 0. Perfect foresight. The representative agent maximizes the discounted present value of log consumption minus the disutility of labor, which is just linear, minus L, subject to this private budget constraint. Now what we're doing is putting the transaction services, or whatever kind of service it is, into the budget constraint with this V term. V is a form of velocity. P, the nominal value of consumption over the nominal value of debt, or real consumption over real debt. As you try to make the ratio of consumption to government debt bigger, this term gamma V, which is the fraction of your consumption expenditures that get absorbed by transactions costs or whatever these costs are, that gets bigger. So bigger V with a given expenditure on consumption goods, which is this term, bigger V leaves you with less consumption goods. You finance your consumption spending plus your purchases of new government debt from your labor earnings, not your labor earnings, the labor you supply, because these agents don't sell their labor to firms. They just supply it, but they're taxed on it. So the resources they have to spend on debt and consumption shrink by the factor 1 minus tau relative to what they produce with their labor. And then they also earn interest on their existing holdings of government debt. So the private first order conditions look like this. This is the C first order condition. This is the L first order condition. And this is the first order condition with respect to debt. I won't go through the algebra step by step, but if you solve these things to eliminate lambda, you get the following two equations. This one says that C times 1 plus 2 gamma V. This is not 1 plus gamma V, it's 1 plus 2 gamma V, and it makes a difference. This is slightly bigger than the transactions cost multiplier in the budget constraint. That equals 1 minus tau. And you can see from this that it turns out that tau can't be negative in this framework. And so long as it's between 0 and 1, the C is bounded. It can't go, it has an upper bound on C. And that will imply also an upper bound on L. This is a differential equation in C and velocity that has to be satisfied in equilibrium. Here's inflation. When inflation is 0 and the rate on government debt equals beta, when inflation is 0 and you're in steady state so that this left-hand side is 0, the nominal interest rate is, where have I got? Gamma V squared should be R, so I'm missing. What term am I missing? I'm not going to try to unravel this right now.
So, Chris?
Yes?
Can students ask questions too?
Yeah,
Just
sure.
to, okay.
Sure.
So if you have any questions, please go ahead and ask questions too.
Yeah, but let me think now. What's going on? Oh, R minus R minus P dot over P. R minus P dot over P is the real rate of return on government debt. If that matches beta, in other words, if debt pays the same amount of same rate of return as the private discount factor, then V has to be 0. In other words, demand for the services of government debt is totally saturated. V can't actually go to 0 without making real debt infinite. So in general, there is a gap, and beta minus the real rate of return on government debt is some positive number, and it is related to V. So that's the private sector. The government sector, we're going to now look for an optimizing government. We're asking, suppose the government is trying to do the best balancing between direct tax distortion from the tax on labor and seigniorage, which is a form of taxation on the use of money for whatever, or debt for whatever services it provides. So they're maximizing the same objective function as the private sector. Their private first order conditions are a constraint on the government. The government constraints include the social resource constraint, which you can get by subtracting the government budget constraint from the private resource constraint. That says that L, labor input, has to be big enough to cover both G, which is real government expenditures, and we're going to treat as fixed and constant, and expenditures on consumption, the actual consumption good, plus the part that has to be wasted on transactions. And the government budget constraint is that current expenditures plus current payment on the government debt must match the revenue from the tax on labor and revenue from issuance of new government debt. So now we're going to look at the question of, suppose there is an equilibrium. Actually, we don't have to assume that all these things are constant at the start. I should have revised this. I think all you have to do is have the tau and R constant to make this work. But for now, we're going to suppose that we're looking for an equilibrium where V, C, P dot over P are all constant. private sector behavior then requires this. This comes from taking the social, the second of the private first order conditions that I showed you before, and setting to zero all the terms that involved time to rates of change in C and V. And this just tells us that gamma V squared is then the gap between beta and the real rate of return on debt. Using little b for real debt, we can then write the government budget constraint out as I've done here. Let me see if there's anything I want particular. I think the next line, this is the government budget constraint in the steady state. Now, as I mentioned, C and L are bounded above for positive tau. It's easy to see that for C. It takes a little more argument to prove that that's true for L also. Revenue tau L has to be bounded above then, since L is bounded above. L isn't physically bounded above, it's just that in no equilibrium will agents find it optimal to make L arbitrarily large. So in equilibrium, revenue from tau L is bounded above. So if we recognize that C and L are bounded above, we're trying to bound all the terms in that government budget constraint. V, which is C over B, can get close to zero only if C is nearly zero, which we don't expect to be true can't be true in an optimal equilibrium. Or C over B can be close to zero if B gets arbitrarily large. But as steady state V approaches zero, the government budget constraint approaches this form. The government budget constraint we wrote out here as V. So we're saying now, could we get V down very close to zero? Can we saturate demand for government debt? If V gets pushed very close to zero, this term drops out, and we're back to this. There's an RB here, and then there's an RB there. They drop out, and what's left is this term, this expression. So B is very big. This left-hand side is very negative. G, where did the G come from? That little g should have been a big G. I've been using big G for the government for expenditures, but it's fixed. This is bounded, so we can't get B arbitrarily large. If we try to make B extremely large, we find that eventually we hit a bound. We just can't finance our current government purchases and our debt service with our labor tax. So there is a bound on B. It's impossible to achieve the Friedman rule in this case. Now, if I changed the way that services of debt enter the budget constraint, in particular, if I entered them in such a way that that transactions costs went to zero at a finite level of debt. In other words, it's possible to satiate the transactions demand for debt, then it would be possible to satiate. But of course, if this involved, then the question would be, what is the satiation point and how big is it relative to G minus tau L over beta? in the model that I've written down here, there's no way you could ever saturate. You can write down models in which it is possible to saturate. But that doesn't really change the nature of the rest of this argument, which is as you're saturating, you're reducing seigniorage revenue, and you have to ask then, is that a good idea given that it forces you to rely entirely on the distorting labor tax? So now I'm going to talk about initial conditions in this economy for a minute. You might not think that should be very important. It turns out it is important for the conclusion that Shari and Kehoe get. Because in this model, it turns out that there's no way to make the gap in rates of return between the gap between beta and the return on government debt. You can't make that small in this model without taxing. What Shari and Kehoe do is, without emphasizing it, they make an assumption that at the initial date, the government creates money by buying private sector assets, thereby creating an initial condition of negative government debt equal in value to the outstanding money stock. In their analysis, then, they conclude that it's optimal to have no gap in rate of return between money and the discount rate. But you would think that because that implies their government liability is non-interest bearing money, so in their framework, achieving the Friedman Rule requires steadily shrinking money balances. You might think, well, that has to involve taxation. They've got to be taxing away money each period. But in their framework, the initial assets of the government match the only kind of liability they have, which is money. So they can, in their framework, money can shrink steadily, and the rate of inflation can be minus beta, which is what's needed for the Friedman Rule, without any taxation, because the government simply steadily sells off its pile of private sector assets to make the money stock shrink. It sells off part of its assets, but because of the deflation, the real value of their assets stays constant, or stays in line with, stays constant, and the real value of money balances stays constant. But in the model we're using here, we're assuming that the government does not have positive assets. And there are lots of reasons to think that it's not a good assumption that the government can finance a large budget deficit without taxation. But one way to argue that is to think about the initial conditions. If we assume that the government can't buy private sector assets, then at time zero, we can ask, what is it optimal for it to do? If there's outstanding, the usual argument is that if there's outstanding debt at the initial date, the optimal thing to do is to repudiate it or inflate it all away. However, in this economy, the real debt is providing transaction services, and it can't be optimal to inflate that all away. In fact, if we try to drive it to zero, we drive consumption to zero. If you assume that at the initial date, there were two kinds of debt, one, this B that provides transaction services, and the other, H, that is valued only for its return and hence pays a higher rate, then the optimal thing to do at t equals 0, if you can't repudiate all your debt, but you can inflate, then the optimal thing to do is jump the price level enough to make the real value of B plus H, which is the initial nominal debt, equal to the value of real debt that it's optimal to have agents holding for transaction services from that date on. So all this discussion is meant to back up an assumption we'll make about the steady state, which is that there are no government assets, there's no debt other than debt that provides transaction services. And the argument is that that's actually optimal, subject to the restrictions we've imposed in this model. So I'm not going to go in more detail into, well, I guess this is an important point. In a stochastic version of this model, a surprise inflation is a neutral tax. So of course, an anticipated inflation or deflation is distorted. But in an equilibrium with stochastic shocks, optimal policy will be to deflate or inflate at each date to maintain the real value of the debt. So what is in this assumed behavior at the initial date, which is that there will be surprise inflation or deflation to make B plus H match the ideal initial B. That same kind of thing is going to be done again and again at every period if there are shocks in the economy. It's a time-consistent policy. The fact that you are going to do this inflation or deflation at the initial date doesn't imply that you have to convince people that you will never do something like that again. Whereas if you inflate away all your debt, that's relying very strongly on the notion that you can do that at time 0, but be believed when you commit not to do it again at later dates.
Can I ask a quick question, Chris?
Yeah.
I'm having a hard time understanding what kind of asset this H is, which is artificially propped up by the government to not provide any liquidity service and still provide the same function to the government. And it's kind of like a magic tool for the government to escape this dual problem of liquidity services and high level of debt.
Well, H is stuff. It might be very long debt. Suppose if you think that the transactions or liquidity services of government debt are mainly from very short government debt, you might think just that B is short government debt and H is long debt. But in general, it's just the notion that there might be in some countries, the US has this very uniform system of federal government debt where the main difference amongst different kinds of federal government debt is just maturity. And there's a deep liquid market in almost every maturity of government debt. But in some countries, debt is issued with different kinds of conditions on when it's callable or conditions on how tradable it is and so on. So you can in an economy where there is you can easily imagine types of government debt that are not uniform, not easily, and hence not so easily tradable. And in this in this model, that type of government debt, while it's assumed it could exist, the optimal thing to do is to eliminate it at time zero and make all your debt liquidity providing debt. Does that help?
Sure, yeah, thanks.
Okay. So I think I've been through how Chari-Kehoe Chari and Kehoe emphasize that their result flows from a money and utility function model which makes utility homothetic in C and real balances. And this little discussion is meant to show that that this model, even though it doesn't have money in the utility, actually can be converted into a money and utility function model that satisfies their conditions. The key assumption that they make that gives a different conclusion from this model is the assumption that the government has assets that match their liabilities. So what I've done is taken this little model, solved for steady state equilibria under different assumptions about what fraction of the total production is committed to government purchases, and different assumptions about how big the coefficient gamma is in this transactions cost term, which determines how big transactions costs are as a function of total output. Just to see in this model where you are forced to consider the trade-offs between saturating the demand for liquidity or transaction services of government debt and instead relying on distorting labor taxes. So here are example numerical solutions. This first one is set, labor turns out to tend to be about 1. Without taxation, it would be exactly 1. So with G equals 0.3, we're looking at equilibria where about 30% of output is taxed away by the government, which is order of magnitude reasonable for the US and other advanced economies. Beta, the private discount rate is 0.02. Gamma is the transactions cost parameter. It's hard to make intuitive sense of that, but over in the right-hand column, we see the transactions cost as a fraction of total consumption expenditure, and that's a little easier to understand. So this model is set up so in these equilibria, transactions costs are never a very big part of total output, which seems reasonable. So I've just calculated the optimal steady state. So the interesting thing is, this is also a model in which the R is set to 0. So the real return on government debt is minus the inflation rate. You could do it all with R set and fixed at any positive number also. Nothing would change except this P dot over P column. But notice that in this is the one of the 3, I'm going to show 3 tables like this. This is the one that's the most pseudo-realistic. And you notice that it's not optimal to drive P dot over P to minus 0.02, which is what would make the real return on government debt match beta. In fact, it's about, you want to go about halfway. Notice also that that almost all of revenue is collected via the labor tax. The total revenue is tau, this number times L. L stays close to 1. Tau stays close to 0.3, so that and 0.3 times 1 is G. So G is almost equal to tau times L. Sigma is the revenue raised from seigniorage, and it's negative. That means that's because it turns out to be optimal to go part way toward the Friedman Rule, and it's worthwhile to tax a little more than you have to just to find finance government's consumption in order to minimize the extent to which you have to use sigma. I'm running out of time here, so this is what happens when there's no government expenditure to finance, and the point of this is that it's nonetheless optimal to do some taxation. With very low transactions costs, you go very close to minus 0.02 here, you're pretty close to the Friedman Rule. And you have to tax in order to do that. But of course, the taxes are much lower because there's no government spending to finance. The taxes are only being used to allow negative seigniorage. So the taxation is very close to the seigniorage. And then the last one is to show what happens if you push G way up so that 80% of output is taxed away, has to be used by the government. And then you start getting positive inflation. The sigma, while still small, is many times bigger. It's positive. You're now using the inflation tax, or you're using seigniorage as a source of revenue instead of taxing to allow negative seigniorage. Technological progress, I'll skip that. You can.
So Chris, can you say again about this negative seigniorage? You want to subsidize money holdings? What's the argument? Why is it? I missed that.
Negative seigniorage just means that you're not raising money. This is the term in the government budget constraint I labeled sigma. Mm-hmm. Because you're creating deflation. To create deflation, you have to tax.
I see. Okay. Buy out money, I think buy back money.
The shrinkage of the money stock, if you think of this as just money, seigniorage is positive when you're expanding the money stock. It tends to be negative when you're shrinking the money stock. That's why it's emerging in the first two tables that sigma is negative. It's turning out that you want to go some way toward the Friedman Rule, and that requires, that makes the seigniorage negative, meaning you have to actually find revenue somewhere else to cover it. But if you get a heavy enough load, say a wartime expenditure or something, level of G, then you might actually, you're pushing the tax into such a distortionary region that it might be optimal to start using, getting positive seigniorage and getting positive inflation even in a model where the nominal rate is fixed at 0. And I'll skip over technological progress. You can ask, what if at time 0 you don't actually inflate away the H, so you have some government debt that doesn't provide liquidity services? You can think of it as being that at time 0 you feel that the government feels it's committed to keeping, to not inflating, not creating a jump in the price level, but to keeping a continuous path of prices. that puts us in the framework of Woodford's timeless perspective, where private sector forward-looking first-order conditions have to be treated as holding continuously. And I haven't actually examined what happens in this case, and just it might be interesting to see if it converges to H equals 0 over time. Now, quickly, so does this model connect up to the current situation? The biggest problem, and it does explain why you might end up with very large government debt and very low interest rates. But the big rise in government debt that's happened in 2008-9 and is continuing to happen now, accompanied by low inflation and low interest rates, couldn't happen in the model that I've just been through. You need to invoke a rise in demand for debt's liquidity services from some shock that is not modeled here. It could be that people in the financial industry have suddenly become much more aware of the possibility of fat tail shocks, and also it's surely true that there's increased regulatory pressure on balance sheets that probably increases the demand for government debt. But you can't explain that within this model. You have to bring in outside shocks like this. If the rise in debt has come from a more realistic assessment of the risk of aggregate shocks that are large, it's not clear that the rise in debt is something bad. It could be an optimal expansion of government liquidity services. But that's, I think the answer to that question depends on a lot of stuff we know very little about. So in the model, there is a cost to expanding real debt, even if you're in a situation where you could increase the debt but not increase taxes. Because even when no taxes are required to back it, the expansion of the debt will in general create reduced seigniorage. The zero fiscal cost debt that Blanchard postulates is it's present whenever there's a gap in between the growth rate of the economy and the rate of return on government debt. Growth rate of the economy is somewhere, ordinarily we think of it as being between the discount rate of the private sector and the rate of return on government debt. So when in this model, the condition that you can add to the debt and not tax and just leave the debt to roll over is exactly the condition in which seigniorage is positive. But even though there's zero fiscal cost in this sense, in this model, there is a need for increased taxation when you increase the level of government debt. And this happens because the return on government debt in this model is endogenous and depends on the ratio of government debt to income. As soon as you recognize that the return on government debt may be an increasing function of the debt to income ratio, you realize that it's possible that you increase debt seniorage remains positive, so that you don't need to cover all the interest on the debt with taxation. And nonetheless, because the interest rate has gone up on all the existing stock of debt, the tax rate must increase. I should make it clear that you can write down models in which over a certain range, there is a stronger version of zero fiscal cost. That is, over a certain range of debt, increases in debt can be self-financing. They can increase sigma t fast enough so that there's no need for increased taxes when debt increases. It's just that in this model, because transactions costs are a very small part of total output, and hence provide a very small tax base, but are nonetheless very important for financing transactions costs. In other words, their derivative with respect to the level of debt is big, even though their level is small. In this model, we don't get there's no range in which debt is self-financing. So I guess I'm already completely out of time. And so I'll stop there and maybe have a chance for one or two questions.
So I have one question actually. So like if you're mentioning regarding like, for example, that limited periods or timeframes are beneficial for zero fiscal costs. So for example, if you would, in crisis times when these liquidity premia on government debt usually are very high, this would principally imply that short-term financed fiscal expansions or like during crises are beneficial or have pretty much zero fiscal cost.
No, it's more complicated than that. I think short-term debt financed expansion in the face of very large shocks like pandemic and the 2008-9 crisis are reasonable even if the debt has no transaction services, just through a consumption smoothing argument. But the fact that the liquidity premium on government debt becomes very large during the crisis doesn't necessarily in itself imply that it's a good idea to expand debt a lot, because if the debt is not going to be paid off till later, and the liquidity premium on government debt is going to shrink later, then the cost may be still quite high. It's a complicated question. From a policy point of view, I think the implications of the kind of thinking in this paper is not that we shouldn't be running deficits in times of major crisis, but rather that we shouldn't be assuming that thinking about the ultimate financing mechanism for the debt can be completely put aside as we're making our fiscal plans during the crisis.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Now is your chance.
No.
Chris, one thing which I think I may have missed in the model is that you don't talk about the transversality condition when you finally set up the Ramsey problem of the government. Is that still satisfied in the problem in the new
Yes, I mean, what I've done is, though you don't see it all, I didn't go through all the reasoning. If you assume that we're talking about equilibria in which tau is constant and the nominal interest rate is constant, including at zero as in those tables, then everything, all the ratios are constant. Inflation rate is constant, consumption is constant in the optimal equilibrium. And since they're all constant, of course, any transversality condition is easily satisfied. So what I did was is assume constant, show that some of the variables were going to have to be constant, then solve for equilibria in which those policy parameters are or I fixed R, and then looked at varying levels of tau and looked for optimal steady states or for solutions to the first order conditions. They're not optimal steady states because the government is discounting. It's a steady state optimal solution to the government's optimization problem. But you don't need the transversality conditions to find the solutions here. They're used only in showing that once you've fixed R and tau, that everything must be constant because that's the only solution that doesn't explode and violate transversality. Anything else?
Chris, can I ask you one more thing? You alluded that, if we force banks to hold government bonds, the whole situation will change. Does it change dramatically? And are there any other extensions of the model? Like, does it matter if prices are sticky in particular ways or not? Or is this irrelevant for the analysis? Or if people are not fully rational? I guess this might be the bond traders who have to be surprised by certain moves.
Yeah, well, being surprised will happen to fully rational people. The first part of your question was about essentially forms of financial repression, where you could just instead of selling your bonds on the open market, you order banks to take them. And in fact, in the US, in the wake of World War II, we had a long period with required reserves, where reserves were fairly substantial. They paid zero interest, and then even a slight inflation, which is the low inflation rates we had in the 50s, 60s, were already bringing down the real value of the government debt. And some of that came through reserve requirements and zero interest on them in the face of a steady inflation. And in some countries, in some periods, there's been a lot of directed credit where governments tell banks what their balance sheet should look like. And of course, if you say that that banks must buy debt at lower than market return, that will create a demand for low interest paying government debt. But it's of course a tax. It's a tax on the banking system. So it fits in the general framework that that somehow or other you're likely to have to tax. And some of the methods that in this model, it's just a labor tax or an inflation tax. In the real world, there can be more complicated forms of indirect taxation.